Rabbi Gross, all yours.
Well, thank you so much. I'll try to, now can I move around? I do move. I know you're, okay, it's wide enough, okay. Because I do better in that way. I'm going to start with, I'm going to try to collapse kind of an introduction to Judaism, contemporary Judaism is like post-temple, as quickly as I can, so I can get to some questions and answers. And the structure that I like to use to talk about what is Judaism and what is a Jew is very, very simple. You'll be able to remember this very clearly. And that is God, Torah, Israel. If you can remember those three words, God, Torah, and Israel, that's basically Judaism in a nutshell. What do I mean by this structure? Well, every faith tries to do exactly the same thing, and that is to connect to mystery, connect to power, connect to the big questions in the world through belief. And the Abrahamic faiths have the belief in a singular God that is the source of everything, and we engage and connect with that God in our own unique ways. Those ways are dictated to us through revelation. Jewish revelation is Torah, and Christian revelation is the Bible, which includes the Torah and the prophets, the writings, the whole Jewish, the Old Testament as well as New, right? For the Jew, Torah and the broader concept of the Jewish Bible, which is called Tanakh, which is an acronym for Torah, Nevi'im, which are the prophets, and the writings, all of which you know in your text as well. That is our canon, right? That is how we connect to God. And those who engage God, approach God, believe in God, live their lives in godly ways through Torah are Jews, or the people of Israel. So God, Torah, Israel. Very simple little block. It's not that simple, of course, right? So let me break that down a little bit more. The Jewish theology is fairly simple in the essence that we believe in one source of all existence, always was, is, and will be. And that source pulses through everything we know, right? So that we call that God. And in the Hebrew text, in the Torah, the God is referred to in 4 letters, which are unpronounceable. It's called the Tetragrammaton for the complex terminology. The Tetragrammaton are 4 letters that are not pronounceable. They're the 4 letters are Yud, He, Vav, He. I don't have a chalkboard here, so I can't really show you those letters. But the sound of those letters are Y, V. There's no vocalization either. No one's knows how to pronounce it except for the high priest in ancient times who would recite that name once a year on Yom Kippur, and that was the only person who would know how to pronounce it. Over time, the vocalization of Ya, Ha, Va, Ha became Adonai, Ah, O, Ah, and then some people started trying to read it by saying Yehovah, right? That's how Jehovah is referenced to the Tetragrammaton. But we don't know how to pronounce it. The most important thing that I'm trying to share, though, is those 4 unpronounceable letters are also the core root of the verb to be. So our ancient ancestors, as we understood God in a way of existence, almost very Zen-like, that God is. In fact, in Hebrew, there is no verb, no word for is. You can say, I was. You can say, I will be. But if you were to say, I am, you just say, I. Is reserved exclusively for God. So that, I think, is a really telling theological idea, that God is the pulse of all existence. It is the essence of being. It's the essence of breath. It's the essence of our soul. It's the essence of our existence. And the way the Jew connects to that essence, that power, is through a vocabulary of commandment. We call it mitzvah. The laws. There are positive laws. There are negative laws. Those laws guide everything that we do. And that is the essence of Judaism. We live and do and obey in a way to connect with the divine. I know you have a million questions, but that's basically the structure. Now, you've been studying you've been studying temple period Judaism. That's the essence of Jesus' time and before. And Jesus was rebelling against how corrupt that whole system had become, and really was questioning, do you have to do all of this in order to connect with God? Is there not just some kind of spirit of these laws that we can embrace? And what is that spirit? And Jesus does a beautiful, beautiful job of articulating that and creating a beautiful faith from those core values. I would argue that modern day Reform Judaism also kind of looks in the same way at these laws as perhaps Jesus did long ago. It's kind of an interesting phenomenon, but I'll get there in a moment. You're talking about the temple times. Before the destruction of the temple by the Romans in 70 of the Common Era, Jewish life was centered in Jerusalem. Jewish practice was temple cult based, right? It was around the sacrifices. It was around pilgrimages. It was around a world that was dictated by agriculture. And even though all the laws are exactly the same in the Torah as they were, a couple thousand years ago at the temple times, we don't really, I'll tell you, we don't sacrifice animals at our synagogue, right? It looks very, very different. And that's the Judaism that we live today. How did that evolve? And I'll do this very briefly, and I'll open it up to questions. After the destruction of the temple, Jews are spread out all over the world. The concept of the temple itself and Jerusalem become a sacred hope, a sacred place that resided always in our prayers. You look at any prayer book, it always has Jerusalem, Zion, the hopes for messianic times of the temple. But we didn't live there, and the temple was gone. And so how do you live in a post-temple world? And that's right around that time also, religion had started to become, or Jewish religion in particular, more and more democratized, and the different sects start to evolve. And in those sects, and in that democratization, is kind of a movement toward prayer, non-temple centered worship, non-temple centered life, pilgrimages that are not necessarily physical, but more spiritual, right? And these things start to evolve. But then when the temple's gone, they become the only remnant of Judaism to be lived and practiced. And so what happens is, and if you were to have an Orthodox rabbi teaching this class, it would sound totally different, okay? The themes would all be the same, but, and I'll get to this as well, but the ideas and how we understand them would be different. So in the more traditional answer, everything was revealed at Sinai, and it just takes time for it to get, so you get the written Torah from Sinai, passed down to Moses, to the people of Israel, through Aaron, right? And then also God speaks to Moses in the ear, and an oral tradition, or the oral Torah, also is articulated and passed down even though it wasn't written down, and then it gets written down later, right? That's the Orthodox approach. The more Reform or contemporary approach is that, Torah unfolds over time, and these oral laws that become written down in what's called the Mishnah in the year 200, and the Talmud, which is, the Mishnah is a commentary on the Torah, and the Talmud is a commentary on the Mishnah, right? And these are written down in 200 for the Mishnah and 500 for the Talmud. And what is the purpose of all of this? What happens is that as we're living in a ritual society outside of the temple cult, dispersed all over the world, how do you create community? How do you have a pilgrimage festival that doesn't have a pilgrimage? How do you observe Sukkot or Passover or Shavuot? What do these all look like in those things? So what happens is the rabbis look at all the structures in the Torah and start to, I wouldn't say interpret them, but articulate them in a broader context, in a broader lived context in diaspora. So those take two different forms. One is commentaries on the lore, which is where we get all of our values and our stories, things like the story of Abraham. Abraham is told by God to go forth at the age of 75 and start over, right? Who was Abraham before? Tons of stories of Abraham before. Those are rabbinic stories and interpretations, much like our sermons maybe, of interpreting and bringing those texts alive for values. That same process is applied to the law. So, for example, in the Torah, we receive the Ten Commandments at Sinai, and in the Ten Commandments it talks about the Sabbath, and it says you should guard the Sabbath and keep it holy. But then it's reiterated again by Moses in Deuteronomy as he's recounting the Exodus, right? And when he recounts the Exodus, he tells about the Ten Commandments again. And on those Ten Commandments, it says, remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. So what's the difference between remember and guard? And then there's all this stuff that comes out and all these laws and rules and this and that. That's how things evolve over time. So I took a very, very simple concept. There are entire tractates of law about how to guard the Sabbath, right? So, and its application. And you take something a little bit more mundane. You have an ox, and that ox is on your neighbor's property, and your neighbor has a hole in his property, and the ox steps in the hole, and the ox falls and breaks its leg. Who's responsible? That's what it says in the Torah, and it kind of talks about it in some context, but then the Mishnah says, well, I don't have an ox. And my neighbor doesn't have a hole, but, so I'm driving my car and my neighbor has a lot of nails in the front yard and I run over the nails. Who's responsible for the flat tires? Those kinds of applications of law unfold over time in huge tractates of Jewish legal literature. So that is how the Judaism that we live today comes to be. How do we celebrate the holidays? How do we observe the Sabbath? How do we engage each other in civil ways? How do we understand big, complicated issues like euthanasia or capital punishment? Capital punishment is a big one. It says, how many times in the Torah does it say to go kill somebody? And then when I say kill somebody, to execute somebody if they've done a crime of eye for eye, tooth for tooth, life for life, right? It says it a bunch of times. And yet, the rabbis somehow completely write that law out of the Torah. Not completely, but they make it so restrictive that it's almost impossible to actually do it. You can't erase God's law, but when you start interpreting it, were there two eyewitnesses to the crime, and were they not related to the person? And there's this huge litany of things that, at the end of the day, it's virtually impossible to actually do capital punishment. That is how our lived Judaism is today. And the final thing before I take some questions, I know there's a whole bunch of stuff, but the final thing, so kind of to review, we lived for a long time under temple cult, sacrificial laws, and a lived experience that was around the temple in Jerusalem. We end up in diaspora. We no longer have that way of life. We reapply concepts that went to the sacrifices to become prayer and laws that were very specific to a specific time and place to apply to our everyday lives today. And it's an ongoing process. What did they say about kidney transplants in the Torah? Nothing, right? And who would have even thought you could take a kidney out? But there's ethics around all of that based on the commandments that we have, right? So we turn to the Torah and the laws, and the Torah is the source text, and then the rabbinic brains that are just incredible, they're really malleable and amazing, try to find applications to those texts in our everyday lives so that we can live Torah law in everyday life. The branches of Judaism really come out of that tension, right? So those who would be called Orthodox Jews in this world are followers of the Torah as it's interpreted through the rabbis to try to live as close to the letter of the law as possible. So they create these very, very tight fences around every single law so you don't stray. Sometimes it's overly tight, just so you got your fat pants, but I'm I'm losing some weight, but these are the pants I hold on to just in case I get big again. But we tighten that belt so we can stay as close to observing the letter of the law as possible. That would be the Orthodox approach. The Reform approach, which is the Reform movement, by the way, comes out of the Age of Enlightenment, because before the date I kind of give, before Napoleon liberates Europe in his own way, but the battle cry being, fraternity, liberty, fraternity, equality, right? You live with these three values, and you're part of the society, right? Religious communities and cultural communities were really almost corporate in nature. They were like every place had its own little community, and in the Jewish community, you weren't allowed out of it. You weren't allowed to engage with the outer world. So it wasn't like there's a question of whether or not you could eat bacon. Nobody in that community even tasted bacon, they should have, but you should know it's tempting. But because you could only buy kosher meat. You could only eat meat that was kosher. That was the only food that was there, right? It's not like you could marry somebody that wasn't Jewish, because everybody in your community was a Jew. There were no non-Jews in the shtetl. So these village communities that were completely closed off become, during the French Revolution, kind of opened up. And now Jews were mixing with the greater community. And they were going to universities, not just their own yeshivas, their own places of study. And with that come different kinds of scholarship. And with that comes an interest in approaching the text through the lens of archaeology or psychology or philosophy, right? There's all these things start to make their way into there's this fluidity of Christian thought and Jewish thought and Muslim thought. Muslims and Jews actually studied and learned together for a really, really long time during the Golden Age of Spain and stuff. So it was a huge, huge period of time where Jewish and Muslim thought were overlapping. But all of that stuff becomes available. And I don't know whether this happens with y'all, but it certainly happens with me. I learned how to pray not from my prayer book, from Christian ministers. I'd be with them, I'm like, oh, that's good. I can listen to the, because we don't know how to do that. We have a prayer for everything. There's a prayer for that cookie, and then there's a different prayer for that tart, you know? My son, who actually has become Orthodox, he's in college, he's at UT, he's become very, very religious. And I was with him one day, and we had gotten him some kosher tacos from a kosher restaurant. Kosher tacos aren't not as good as the taco stand that I go to. But so he says his blessing before he eats his taco. And I see this look on his face. I said, "What's wrong? Is it okay?" He goes, "I said the wrong blessing." I said, "What do you mean you said the wrong blessing?" He says, "It's a corn tortilla." But it makes a difference, because the blessing that you say before affects the blessing that you're going to say after the meal. So it's very, 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 very set. But then I started hearing ministers pray, and I'm like, oh, it's so free. That's like, you're like channeling the moment. This is like God, and oh, it's just great. So but my question was, I see things in other faiths that I envy, and I go, I want to learn how to do that. That was happening as Jews start praying in an open society. They're like, oh, that organ music is so cool, because Jews have not used, if you go to Orthodox synagogue, you will not hear instruments. Since the destruction of the temple, instruments have not been allowed for worship. Or they'll go, oh, wow, that man is sitting with his family when they're praying. You go to an Orthodox synagogue, there's women on one side and men on the other, right? So as this starts to evolve, I call it religion envy. You start going, I like that, or I like that thought, or I like that music. And you start borrowing and incorporating. And that starts to shape, and it's shaped faiths over time, and I'm sure you've experienced it just within the last 20, 30 years, just kind of modern music compared to more contemporary, the classical music. We kind of shape, so that starts to happen, and a movement comes out of that, which later becomes called the Reform movement. And where our approach, same beliefs, same holidays, same God, same Torah, everything's the same, but our approach to it is different. Whereas the more observant Jew looks to live by the letter of the law, the Reform approach is to find the kernel or the spirit. What is it? Stop arguing about what you can or can't do to make Shabbat or the Sabbath a holy day. What is the purpose of the Sabbath? Like, what is the essence of what the Sabbath is supposed to be? And then create that moment, create that day with your family, by yourself, whatever it might be. It might involve worship, and you might live 20 miles from the synagogue that you like, so by driving, you're breaking the Sabbath, right? So if it enables you to be part of the Sabbath in a sacred, holy way, drive. Or if you want to be with your family because you're working every single day of the week, you take that day to preserve and you want to embrace family, but you've got to pay some money and drive to go to the zoo. But now you're at the zoo with your family and you're immersed in God's world, and God, this is great, right? So the Reform movement strives to find ways to connect with the faith and our people and our culture and our history. But we're looking for connections through the spirit of those laws rather than specifically a rigid, concrete living of the letter of the law. And that is so oversimplified, but it gives you just kind of an essence of what it is. So I think I'll stop there because I know that you have a million questions that might be continued, but that is kind of the essence of post-temple Judaism in the diaspora. So I'll open it up to unless you want, I could talk forever, but let me allow you to ask, because I know you had some interesting questions that I had been sent as well, but let me open it up to the floor. Yes?
What you were just talking about I'm not going to be able to use your words, but the easing up of the strictness, is that different in every congregation? Is that different in every, and I'm sure do you even call Jewish congregations?
Yes, they're congregations, yeah.
Is that different? Or is it interpreted differently because of who the rabbi is, who the congregation is? That's
a fabulous question. All right, so we'll start in the more observant, the stricter, right? And they can get really, 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 really narrow in their interpretation. So in that community, it's almost an absolute yes. Depending on your rabbi, and depending on who that rabbi's rabbi was, and that rabbi's rabbi, it's going to be a string of tradition of interpretation of the laws in certain ways. The most concrete and probably impactful example of this, it has to do with food. So there are a whole bunch of different stamps that you can find on food that will articulate whether or not, or communicate whether or not that food is kosher. Depending on whether your rabbi or your community recognizes that stamp, your community might not eat. So that would be an example of the rabbi having a major say in it. But most of the Orthodox world is looking to. They live pretty much exactly the same way, and they would argue it's a matter of choice, right? But their choices are really, really narrow. The Reform say it's a matter of choice, right? But my choice is like, will I eat bacon or will I not eat bacon, right? There's not even a choice in the Orthodox. I joke about that because my wife, we had a study like this just a couple of weekends ago, and we were talking about sin, and we were talking about sins that are a form of rebellion, right? You know it's a sin, and you're gonna do it anyway because she goes, I eat bacon, I'm going to continue to eat bacon. I know it's a sin, but I'm just going to continue to eat bacon. You know, like, to everybody in the congregation. They're like, okay. So, but it's a choice. And so in Reform circles, every individual is supposed to make an informed choice based on his or her learning, right? So ideally, you would know all of these laws, and then you would make a choice based on how you understand the essence to be. It doesn't really work that way. It really works out that most Reform Jews are non-observant, especially of ritual commandments. Hopefully they're observant of the ethical commandments, because there are, there's ritual ones, and then there's, thou shalt not steal. So to answer your question specifically, it really doesn't vary that much in terms of a Reform rabbi's approach would be to encourage people to learn and then make a decision based on knowledge. The Orthodox would be the same. They just have a lot more knowledge, and they will not break those rules. And then there's something called the conservative movement, which is right in the middle. And that's an interesting one because with the conservative movement, they kind of do a compromise. They have an assembly of rabbis that make decisions, and then rather than it being completely individual, I'll give you another example. Orthodox Jews, intermarriage, absolutely 100% forbidden. In the conservative movement, the Board of Rabbis have dictated that we understand the complexities of the situation. We'll embrace interfaith families in our communities, but we forbid rabbis from doing interfaith weddings. The Reform movement is guided by your own understanding of the law and your understanding of society and your understanding of the needs of the community. You make your own decisions as rabbis. So that would be a really concrete example of how those communities work. So I happen to be the only rabbi not the only, for a while, the only rabbi that not only did interfaith weddings, but I did interfaith weddings with other clergy. And I did one with Pastor Power, yeah, Towers, at the was at the River Oaks together. He and I did a wedding together. It was really nice. But every Reform rabbi has a different approach, and I contextualize that in a broader understanding of love and relationship and everything. So I hope that answered your question.
Is there much animosity between the group?
There can be. At times like we're living today, I actually was studying with an Orthodox rabbi on Zoom. He's a good friend of mine. He now lives in Denver. And we were talking about, he was telling a story that, I can't remember, I think it was Rabbi Soloveitchik, who was a very, very famous rabbi, talks about if you have a two-headed child, this is such a grotesque example. Jews are very blunt. But you have a two-headed child, and you pour, how do you know that is it one or is it two? And if you pour boiling water on the head of one of the children and the other one cries, then you know that you're one. And right now the Jewish community feels like a two-headed child, but we're getting water poured on us on both heads, so at times like this, it doesn't matter if you're Orthodox or Reform or conservative or when you're getting bombarded with hate and you're being targeted on all sides, you come together as a people like never before. The more, I would say the Orthodox sometimes are a little bit off, I mean to the side, and the more, the conservative and Reform Jews are more of a body of, we call ourselves non-halachic Jews. So, but even so, I would say there's just small pockets of Orthodoxy that really close themselves off to the rest of the world. Jews really do feel an affinity and a people, because we're more than just a faith. That's the other piece I didn't bring up, but it's a people. Bound together by belief, but also language, history, oppression, land. So it's a people as well. I think you had your hand up.
I have several questions.
Okay.
Okay, first of all, we have Yahweh.
Yes.
Is that the same?
That's the Tetragrammaton. That's the we just never pronounce that name.
Say that.
So what we say when we see those four letters is Adonai, which means Lord.
Right.
So, but what you're saying when you say Yahweh, you're vocalizing the unpronounced letters.
Okay. Then my next question is, the Jewish calendar 6,000 years ago, I'm a creationist. I believe, that God created heaven and earth. Is that Jewish thought, or do we have the evolutionary, how long a day is?
Yeah, so that's really
Having 6,000 years, or we have untold millions?
Yeah, Jews don't. Yeah, untold. Jews don't. Most Jews, I can't say all Jews, but I would guess that almost all Jews believe that those two ideas are not contradictory. That the concept of 6,000 years, it's actually, for the Jewish calendar, it's 5,785, starting next Wednesday. Very specific. And the concept of evolution and the concept of billions of years of the universe are not contradictory in thought. For two reasons. One is the calculation of the age of the world according to that Jewish thing was counting up things like, Abraham lived to this, and there was a guy in the Bible who would live to 900, and they count backwards all of those from when they started trying to figure out the age of the universe at that time, all the way back to Adam and Eve, right? And they came up with this number. That's how it was calculated, at least for Jews. But here's an idea that blew my mind when I experienced it. We were in This was at my two oldest kids' B'nai Mitzvah. We had it in Israel. And we were in what's called the Maktesh, which is Mitzpeh Ramon, which is it's often referred to as a crater, but it's not a crater. It's actually a geological formation caused by the shifting of the earth, right? But it's like this big crater space. And we're in the middle of this crater space, and the sun is setting, and it's as silent as the desert. If you've ever been in the desert, as the sun is setting, it's not only magical, but it is so quiet. And two really powerful things came to me as we were in that space. The first is, where do Jews find God in the desert? Where do the apostles, receive Jesus? It's in the desert, right? And not receive him, but after what's it called? Not Pentecost. Pentecost? Yeah, right. Isn't that when the word comes? It's in the desert, right? Where does Muhammad find God? In the desert. The desert is a place where it's so quiet. You have those aha moments. You have that revelation. It's so real. And the other is the guy who was with us was a geologist, and he told us to pick up the sand, right? And we pick it up, and it's a little bit sticky, but it's mostly dry. And he said, when they first started figuring out that with a little bit of water, you can start to make a vessel. And then with that vessel, you don't have to worry about whether it's going to rain or not. You can collect and hold that water. And when you can collect and hold that water, you can start to restructure your society, right? When did that happen? About 6,000 years ago. And so he suggested to us that, yes, the Torah talks about the world being 6,000 years old, but it's 6,000 years old as we know it. It's 6,000 years ago when they started actually coming together as a civilization and inscribing things and sharing things and teaching things in a totally different way. It was that shift that brings the concept of faith and God and humans and earth all together. So creation, as we know it as human beings, is about 6,000 years old, but creation as God knows it is eternal, right? We don't put an end on God's realm or power. So that goes on billions of years. It's just the human understanding of that creation. Otherwise, up until that point, we were not that different than elephants. That we were, but in the sense that we would be in the desert, we might be looking for water, but once you start to be able to use tools and come together as a society, it shifts. So I don't know if that answered your question, but Jews understand. That's a really good question because next week is our birthday of the world. So.
One more question.
Oh, okay.
The 12 tribes.
Yes.
Is there a listing? Do they have any kind of records of, surely they had names of everybody from, say, the tribe of Benjamin? And
All the names of everybody?
Was that all, in 70 AD, was that all destroyed, or?
No, well, I mean, they certainly have the names of the tribes, and then they have the leaders of the tribes, but I don't know if they ever had the names of everybody in those tribes. That I don't know.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
After the first temple was destroyed, how many tribes were there? 10? 12. 10 of the tribes disappeared, right?
Well, the kingdoms become Judah and in Israel, but they get. I'm not really good with my biblical history. Those details. I forgot as soon as I took the test. But
talking about orthodoxy versus reform, what do each of those groups think about Paul?
On all of the groups, we don't really give any thought to Paul. And I don't mean that in any kind of, because we don't study Paul. I've never really read anything about Paul except that, as I understand it, he was kind of, his teachings and works kind of created the church. But that's what I've heard. But I really don't, I don't know anything about Paul. Yes?
How does the Jewish community as a whole feel about Jews who become Christians, Messianic Jews? Is there a negative?
So I love the way you said both of those things, because so we would call Messianic Jews Christians, right? So and it's a really interesting question, because for the faith piece of it, the word you would be leaving the faith, and it would be very hard, emotionally very hard for most Jews as they see their children leave the faith. And it's actually that feeling for most faiths, like, oh my gosh, you almost feel rejected as a parent. And for the Jewish community, which is quite small, we're like, we're losing a member. For Orthodox Jews, if you have a Jewish mother, and she had a Jewish mother, right? So if my mom was Jewish, my mom is Jewish, my grandma's Jewish, it all goes all the way back. I'm Jewish, right? And I decided to be a minister. And I left Judaism and I became a minister. Oddly, I'd still be a Jew to them. because of the peoplehood piece. And I actually, just this week, had the weirdest conversion situation I've ever faced. Because this 11-year-old girl, whose mother isn't Jewish, father is Jewish, she's being raised Jewish, but she wants to have her bat mitzvah in Curacao. At this, anyway, very, very cool synagogue, by the way. It's like the oldest synagogue in the Western Hemisphere. It's all sand floors. It's really, you should look it up. It's a really neat place. But they want to have their ceremony there. The rabbi is conservative, leaning, very, very conservative, kind of between conservative and Orthodox. And they won't allow somebody to have, in his mind, she's not Jewish. The mother wasn't Jewish. But he also was liberal enough to accept my conversion, right? The kid's 11 years old. All I had to do to make her Jewish is go to the mikveh, which is a ritual, it's our ritual bath, and she just needed to immerse herself and say the prayer. And I had 3 rabbis there that we all signed the document that she did it. And now she's Jewish. Now, I had to do it this week because in 2 weeks she turns 12. Once she turns 12, it's a whole different ballgame. She would have had to convert like an adult. But she converted like you would convert a baby, like you would do a baptism or something like that. So it's very, very, but your question kind of covers those 2 ideas of faith and peoplehood. Orthodox Jews would only recognize a child if they're born to a Jewish mother as being a Jew. In the Reform and conservative movements, not all conservative rabbis, but in the Reform movement for sure, we consider any child that's raised as a Jew, whether the mother, one or the other parent has to be Jewish. But so a person who converts out, for the Reform Jew, we would, be a little bit, or I wouldn't say even sad, but we would be losing a Jew to another faith. And to the Orthodox, they're just, doing something different. They're still Jewish. Because it's just, so. Yes.
Are you referring to Orthodox Jews and non-Orthodox Jews, or Orthodox Jews and Gentiles? Or both? As far as it being strictly forbidden?
No, it would be Jews and Gentiles. An Orthodox Jew could marry somebody who was a non-Orthodox Jew, and yeah.
It reminded me of what I consider a funny story. It still makes me
Yeah.
smile all these years later. Our nephew, who was raised Catholic, married a little Jewish girl, and we were there at the wedding, and one of the things I got a kick out of, really, the rabbi who officiated obviously knew there were lots of people there who were not Jewish, and spent so much time explaining everything, and
Yeah.
almost took all the fun out of it.
Oh, yeah, it became a lesson rather than a wedding.
It really was. He explained every little thing so everybody would understand what was going on.
That's very Jewish.
And what really meant.
It's,
It was so funny.
yeah.
Okay, so like, you mentioned that your son, I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, go, and then, yeah.
Yeah, has gone Orthodox. Is that challenging? Does he like look on you in a less positive, like judge you for not being?
So it's an interesting journey. It's a very hard one for me and my wife, because it really reshapes how we can travel together, how we spend time together, how we, because it's structured around 3 times a day of prayer, and the Sabbath is strictly forbidden to do anything, and food is don't get me started on the food, but so those things are very, very challenging for him. One of the most important things is to honor your mother and father. So, I mean, you've got all these other commandments that are non-ritual, and he's embracing them, and it's beautiful to see him living with such intention and kindness and a desire to kind of get at the core of kindness and compassion through ritual. It keeps him focused on God all the time, and so those things are really, really beautiful. There will come moments. See, I know well enough just to let him be and to embrace, and then just embrace him. My wife is constantly asking him questions, and then because she wants to learn, and then of course it gets her upset, and then because there's a lot of rules about men and women and those kinds of things, and it does make things complicated. But and then there's the bacon. I don't think he'll ever appreciate that in her. But it's her sin. It's not his. You had a thought. Yeah.
Well, this is our 5th session that we've learned about Judaism, and what I gathered from that and what's been presented is that the Jews have always been oppressed. They've always been shunned. They've always been beat up. They've always been, forever.
Yeah.
What is so compelling about the Jewish faith to keep them so fervent?
Yeah.
I mean,
that was despite all the oppression.
Despite all the
Yeah.
oppression, to stand up in the wind, so to speak.
Oh, that's a really good, and your point is a good one. Anti-Semitism is a unique form of hate. It's one of the oldest. It keeps morphing, and it is really it's hate is baffling anyway. But the kind of hatred toward Jews has really just been ever present. But maybe that's actually why we're hated. It's because no matter how much people try to put us down, it's just like, we're not going to pay attention to you because we've got these particular things that make us a people, and these particular things that connect us to God, and these particular things that connect us to each other. It's a faith that in a lot of ways is super, super logical. There's a ton of really, of course, rituals they don't always make sense, but most of the faith part of it is pretty simple. this idea that there's something that pulses through us and that we connect to that source by respecting its vessel, right? So I can respect the vessel of you by being kind and compassionate and merciful, right? I can respect the vessel of the earth by being a good steward of it. I can, right? It's pretty simple in that way. And then there are very specific laws that tell us how to do that. I don't know why we're so resilient, but I think because of that oppression, and because we have to constantly apply those laws to the modern day, it's a very rich faith with complex thinking of that logic. So we have all these restrictions on the Sabbath, right? But you can't live. I mean, you can live with all those restrictions, but you can also live. You can live with those restrictions without having them be restrictive. So, the crock pot, believe it or not, was invented by a Jew. The crock pot was a way to cook for the Sabbath, right? You can't start a fire on the Sabbath. So you have to, if you want hot food, it has to be started before the Sabbath begins. So this guy developed this thing to keep your food warm. So as long as it started before the Sabbath, you're okay. So chicken soup's a great food because it just cooks all day long. My daughter, by the way, is studying to be a conservative rabbi, and she was studying just this. I said, "What are you studying today?" She goes, "Well, I'm studying, but like, when can you put the water on the, when can a food be reheated, and when does it transgress the Sabbath if it's reheated?" And I said, "Well, explain that to me." She goes, "Well, like if you made chicken soup and you put it in the refrigerator, you have to be very careful, even if you put it on like a crock pot, because you can't let it boil. If it comes to a boil now, you're cooking and you're breaking the Sabbath. If it only comes to a certain level of heat, you're okay." So all these kinds of laws. An elevator, right? You go to a hotel in Jerusalem. Yes. All right, you've been there, right? And you don't get on the Sabbath elevator because it's going to take you forever to get to your room. You got to know which one's the Sabbath elevator. It just goes up and down, stopping on every floor up, every floor down, right? Jews have so you can't carry on the Sabbath. I love the Sabbath rules because we've been so good at being able to observe, but by broadening the law. So the law is you can't carry. I can't carry this from this table. Well, if this is my house, and I'm moving over to this house, I can't bring it over to this house. You're forbidden. These laws are based on the prohibitions that you find in the Torah with the building of the tabernacle. That's where all these restrictions come in. So, but if this table and this table make an agreement that you are one single property, now you can all bring your stuff over there and you can bring your stuff over there. Now what if an entire neighborhood decides that they're going to share their property and it just needs to be demarked? Now everybody in that community can walk around. You can bring a dish over to so-and-so's house. You can walk with your stroller and carry your keys. You can, right? All of these things because you know the law. You're living within the law, but you need to create areas that allow for the law to be lived. And because of that, it goes back to your question, I think that's a big reason why we've been so resilient, because we've been not fighting the law, but working with the law, working with these constrictions and pressures forever, since our very existence. Just trying to figure out if you can carry something. Broaden that to, can we defend ourselves, or can we, that's, and the sense of peoplehood is super, super deep, which goes back to the question you had asked about. Yes.
Actually, I have two, but I want other people to be able to just throw one out. Give us at least your interpretation. I realize that there's, as a Reform rabbi or Jew, there can be different interpretations. The book of Job has always been a fascinating book, I think, in both the Judaic tradition and Christian tradition as well. What are some of the core things that you read from about the book of Job in terms of what you take away from the nature of God, from our relationship with God? And I'm thinking in particular with Rabbi Kushner's book on When Bad Things Happen to Good People.
Yes, yeah.
He wrote another one. But give us your ideas from the sense of, not speaking perhaps for all rabbis, but what is your sort of core takeaways from that book?
Yeah, I think there are a few that I think almost every rabbi would kind of lean toward, although there will be much bigger scholars in this field. There are a couple of things. One is the role of Satan, which is an interesting one, right? Satan exists in Jewish thought, in Jewish text, but in a very different way than it's understood in Christianity. So I bring that up. And you've got a great example of it in Job, because Satan says to God, let's test this guy, who thinks he's so righteous, he's going to break, right? So the role of Satan is a nice one for us to understand collectively as Jews and Christians, that Satan in Jewish thought and in Jewish literature serves as a foil to goodness or a foil to God, to kind of set up the story that's about to unfold. And you see that pretty much as a pattern in our shared literature. We just understand Satan maybe in a different way. So that's one takeaway. The second is the test itself is just so brutal. I mean, the poor guy is just, getting beaten down, but he's insisting on his righteousness and insisting on, right? And finally, at the end, it's just so awful. He finally breaks. I mean, how much can one person take before they lose faith? And he questions God. And the punchline is really that end piece, which is basically, where were you when I created the world? Where, you know nothing. You can be as righteous as you want. You can believe that, by offering your sacrifices the way you do, that it's going to impact me. But you really don't know anything, because you're just Job. And that's the punchline. So what I take from that very, very trying story is that even in our darkest moments, even in our times of just terrible trial, you can go into the woe me, or you can say, is there a bigger picture here that I don't understand, and kind of let go a little bit and try to just be in the mud, but with some hope beyond that. I think that's what I take from it. Now at the very, very end, then Job gets rewarded with all these camels and stuff, right? From a literary perspective, again, the Reform movement, and I'm part of that, looks at the Bible in lots of different ways as a doctrine of faith and everything. But the way we would look at that is that was added on later. The way a more traditional says, no, that's God-given story. So, and I don't judge either way. I find it inspiring either way. But I see that last part as kind of like, that doesn't fit any of the rest of the story, where now I'm going to reward you with a million camels and riches. Any other, yes?
A couple of weeks ago, we had a guy from HCU that was talking about some history about the temples and everything. And he was also talking about, well, it was mainly Judaism during the time of
Temple.
Christ.
Mm.
And they brought up the story of Christ being in the synagogue. And that got me thinking, and I asked him, but he never got around to it. When did synagogues develop You had the temples.
Yeah.
When did synagogues develop?
So around that time, you find archaeological ruins of synagogue floors and stuff. So there is clearly gathering places for localized, what's kind of emerging as prayer, places to learn, right? Synagogue is a Greek word, so you've got synagogue, you've got temple, they're all got, but there are these, in Hebrew it would be a Beit Knesset or a Beit Mikdash, these places of gathering or study. And you know that what they are because they have donors, just like we have here today, right? They're like a little, kind of like a little mosaic tile, and it has the name of the family given in memory of. But so it's around that time when I talked about the democratization of faith, of the Jewish faith. It's this non-temple centered practices start to evolve. Right, and it's impacted also. I talked about this in where Reform movement comes in. But these kinds of attractions are taking place as Jews interact with Hellenist ideas, and so you've got all of these powerful philosophical movements evolving all around. And I'm not, again, an expert in any of that, but that's what's taking place around that time. And the other thing is, we talk about 100 years as if it's just, in the year 500, in the year 200, like that's 300 years. That's older than the United States, right? You were like, oh yeah, the Ottoman Empire was from, 1492 to 1918. Like that's a long time. So that period of time is 100, it could be half the age of the United States is evolving faith things. So our interactions right now have an impact on Jewish-Christian relations in the Tanglewood neighborhood, right? We morph and grow and interact and start to learn, and there's fluidity, but we only know it in terms of a week or a year or something. And you talk about it over the course of 300 years, you start to have real shape going to religious groups. You had a second one, too.
I was just curious. I think you probably touched on it earlier, but you mentioned the Talmud and the
Mishnah, yeah.
The Gemara, the Mishnah, the commentaries, and I think you made reference to maybe it was one of the traditions that had maybe a group of rabbis that sort of helped shape, okay, this is how what we think this means. I think what you were saying is that tradition has continued.
Oh, yes.
Okay, so can you talk a little bit about what would have been, you mentioned the death penalty, or putting people to death. How have there been any recent sort of aha moments where these groups, either through the process of commenting on current life and applying Torah or applying the Jewish law, how that maybe has manifested some critical changes?
Yeah. So first of all, it's much like American jurisprudence, right? You've got the Constitution, then you've got the next level, and then you got case law, and then you got it's all of these levels of law. It works kind of like that in Judaism as well. You've got the Torah. The Torah says this. Now the death penalty is a complicated one because it really gets narrowed by these academies of thought, and we'd have to really kind of tease through it to get all that nuance. But But the way it works in all of the circumstances is you get the Torah's law, you try to apply it, and it gets interpreted by these academies over the course of hundreds of years, and then written down. And then that writing down of the laws is called the Mishnah. And then the Talmud are many, 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 many academies interpreting and struggling with, and rabbinic scholars of that time, which is between the year 200 and 500, 300 years of struggle. And it finally gets codified into a document as well. So that process is just filled with stories and examples and cases, and so it just kind of evolves, but it's all linked. It can't contradict the Torah. So they never say the death penalty cannot be done. They just over time create many, many, many restrictions to make sure that you are not actually committing murder yourself, right? And the only time it's ever been enacted in Israel, the death penalty's only happened once in all the history of Israel, is the courts sentenced Eichmann to death. And that was it. And in that case, they had all the witnesses. I mean, hundreds of thousands of people witnessed him killing people. And they had all of the criterion were met so that could be implemented. But take something a little bit more, a little less complicated than that. Like I mentioned, a kidney transplant, right? So they don't mention anything about a kidney transplant in the Torah. They wouldn't even known that you could take a part of your body out and put it into somebody else. But there is a value in Judaism. Very frequently in these, we call them machloket, these arguments between scholars, between values, they're often two very good values that are coming head to head. So one value is the saving of a life, and there's a teaching that the saving of a life is like the saving of a world, because with that one life, you kind of have an entire world of people that come from you, right? And the other value is a messianic idea that when the Messiah comes, there will be a time on earth where there's a return of the body to the images from Ezekiel, in the valley of the bones, where the bodies come back together in this messianic time, and there's a giant party in Jerusalem. But that value is very, very serious and held onto even in Jewish prayer. Every single time a Jew prays, we have a phrase in our prayers when we talk about the power of God. It says, Mechayeh metim berachamim rabim, who gives life to the dead with compassion and mercy. The idea of resurrection is something that is ancient and was part of the Judaism of the time of Jesus, right? There's a strong belief, and it's woven into Jewish prayer. If I give away my kidney, I'm not whole. How's my body going to come back, right? So there's that value coming head to head with the value of saving a life. And so in very observant communities, it's actually hard to get like kidney transplants or organ transplants because of that idea. And many times if somebody has diabetes, they'll bury, if they have to remove a foot or a toe or a leg, they'll bury that in the grave that you'll eventually be buried in, right, one day, because there's this idea. Now, the more liberal, when I even say liberal, I mean even more like the more liberal interpretations in the Orthodox world would say, well, if you're going to save a life, God will find a way for that kidney to get back into you, right? So he's got powerful. So save the life. But if you're talking about a heart transplant, what defines death? Right? There's the modern definition of death compared to the definition of death. So the older definition of death is when you stop breathing. The modern definition of death is brain dead. you can't live without a heart. You can live with one kidney. You can't take the heart out of a living person, right? And so then it gets complicated in these medical ethics. And so it's these kinds of things. So what happens is you have these cases that then get applied to new circumstances. And this literature is called responsa literature. It's basically like ask the rabbi, is it okay if I get a kidney transplant? Is it okay, rabbi, if I get a tattoo? You know, that's a good one for me all the time. Like, okay, what's it going to be? So, right? So was that a good, I mean, oversimplified answer, but that's kind of how the process works. And I don't want to make it sound like we are changing the law, because that's not supposed to be changed as it is in the Torah, but we're trying to find a way to live by the law in a society that has different realities than we may have had in the desert. Any other?
We are straight up 8 o'clock, so is there one more question?
Can't remember if you had any, like, just ones that just jumped out on this either.
The only one I remember from that was, and I've been reading one of my kids, so I don't know if you touched on this, but like how far, when you see the distinctive dress of the Orthodox, how far back does that date?
1800s. So that is very, very cultural. It becomes a very strong, almost like the Amish, right? It's about the same time. Very, very much like the Amish. And it's from a very, so these different communities too, you can, like they all, if you look at the black hat community, you go, oh my gosh, you think it's one community. But some wear a different kind of sock. Yeah. Some wear their hats in a slightly different way. There are like the ultra-Orthodox Zionists that wear, they're called a knit kippah. They'll wear it to the side, or they'll wear it in the middle. I mean, there's just like little signs of these communities that are different. You know, these Polish communities have, they wear these like sable hats that are they cost thousands of dollars. They're just like, who wears a sable hat in Israel? It's not even that cold. It's just like, the Polish. So, but yeah, those garb is one of those identifiers that the people hold on to really well. The one question I see on here that probably is of value is afterlife concepts. The easiest and most honest answer is God only knows what happens to us after we die. I mean, that's the most believed thing in Judaism. But we do have about 6 beliefs, all of which are Jewish, all of which you could be believed completely, or you could believe some and not others. The first of which is there is something of us that is not the vessel, right? In the book of Genesis, it says that God creates us from the dust of the earth and then breathes a soul into us. So we believe in a soul. And when the vessel dies, the vessel returns to the earth, our carbon, and right, we become earth again, and our souls return to its maker, which is very vague, powerful and beautiful, but it's vague. A second piece that kind of connects to that too, of where that place would be, is the concept of Sheol. It's an ancient concept of a netherworld. It's not really defined, but it was believed that people would live in that netherworld, in their spirit, kind of similar to what they did here. So sometimes you find tools and stuff, like if you were a lumberjack, you might be buried with an axe or something, right? So there's this concept of another world, and there's a concept that the soul goes back to a place. There's also, as I mentioned earlier, this concept of resurrection so your soul can be put back into the body, right? And then become whole again. And then the question is a soul that was lived in a vessel that was evil or bad, does that soul, it just says it goes back to its maker, does it go to the same place that somebody who was good? Judaism is not a faith that lives in order to get to that place. We're going to that place. We die, we go to that place. why should I be good? Well, it's not about being good or bad. You're commanded to do this. So you either do it right or you're transgressing. We should talk about sin too, but we won't go there. I mean, that's a powerful idea as well. So, and then there's, so that's acceptable. So what happens in the rabbinic literature that we've been talking about is you do get descriptions of heaven and hell and concepts like this that evolve out of dialogues with Christians and Zoroastrians and other faiths that have these complex ideas of otherworldly heavens, right? And then there's also, if God has the power to be able to take a soul and put it back in at resurrection, could God not choose to send a perfect soul back to the earth from, and try to inspire others to be good? In fact, that's what I was just writing about for my Yom Kippur sermon. They're called the Lamed Vavniks. There's 36 of these souls that the mystical term is Gilgul HaNefesh. It's basically almost like a reincarnation, that these 36 perfect souls are put back on earth constantly. They're always there. They could be in our presence right now. We don't know who they are. They don't know who they are. They're always here, though. And they're wandering the earth. God has put them there for inspiring us. And then there are some who just believe that we return to the earth and become dust again. So all of those are Jewish concepts. The afterlife is rich in thought, but it's not dogma. We don't have to believe in it, but it is there for us to believe in. So that's the Jewish belief around those ideas.